Although the earliest known painted and drawn images date back to the Stone Age, and the earliest surviving print was made well over 1,000 years ago, images recorded by a camera or on a computer belong to the quote unquote modern age. The camera relies on a natural phenomenon that's been known since antiquity, that light reflected from an object can, under controlled circumstances, project an image of that object onto a surface. It was not until the 19th century, however, that the projected image could be captured and preserved. The word photography literally means light writing, although a more accurate description might be light drawing. Because, like drawing, photography can either be a practical tool or it can be an art form. It has commercial and personal applications. It is widely available to professional organizations as well as individual consumers. Among these individuals are artists. This chapter explores photography from its beginnings through to the digital revolution. So the goal of fine art photography is to express an idea, a message, or an emotion. This may stand in contrast to other categories of photography that we'll talk about, such as photojournalism, which provides a documentary visual account of specific subjects and events, literally representing objective reality rather than the subjective intent of the photographer, and also commercial photography, whose primary focus is to advertise products or services. So there's lots of different types or categories of photography. Beyond its many uses in journalism, science, advertising, and personal record keeping, photography offers artists a powerful means of expression. We're looking at Jane and Louise Wilson's photograph, "The Silence is Twice as Fast Backwards One." The image really captures this magical moment in a lush green forest. It looks as if the artist went for a morning walk and stumbled upon a wooded glade flooded with beautiful streaming sunlight. The picture they printed is 6 feet square, so imagine that really filling the entire field of your vision. It's almost like you could step through it, it's so large. In a way, we can imagine ourselves when we look at this picture that we are the ones looking into the scene as we walk through the woods and happen upon this lucky, beautiful moment where light filters through the trees in just such a way. Could you imagine capturing this on your phone, perhaps? One of the most important distinctions between photography as an art form and other mediums is the notion that photography democratizes image making. Products like the early Kodak camera or the Brownie sold for $1, and that meant that anyone could take a photograph, send the camera back to Kodak, and then have their pictures developed and sent back to them. In the art of photography, though, a skilled photographer makes many choices about composition, angle, focus, distance, and light. The Wilson sisters carefully composed this image. The 3 trees are perfectly positioned in the frame, and the branch that leads our eye in from the lower left points upward to connect with the foliage off the second tree. Note how the branch at the lower right seems to almost parallel the one at the lower left in a kind of rhythmic repetition. These curving branches lie at a roughly 90-degree angle to the sun's rays that stream in from the upper left, and the artist seems to have set the exposure of the shot perfectly as well, so that the details are visible even in the most intense areas of light and darkness. And one more fact completes this photo's sort of contrivances or constructions or its artfulness, if you will. And that is, to create the effect of sunlight, the artists actually released some mist into the scene before photographing it. So we're touching a little bit on another question that comes up often in terms of photography. Is photography telling the truth? Does the picture tell the truth? Can the picture lie? We'll talk more about that as we move through the module together. The basic concept of the camera itself, though, preceded actual photography by many centuries. The forerunner of the modern camera was the camera obscura, literally meaning dark chamber or dark room. Sunlight passes through a small hole in the wall of a darkened room and projects onto the opposite wall an inverted image of whatever lies outside. This ability of a pinhole to form an image appears to have been known to the ancient Chinese as early as the 4th century BC, and was first described outside of China by the Arabian scholar Alhazen in about 1030. A clear description of the formation of images by a small hole in a darkened room is also contained in the manuscripts of Leonardo da Vinci in the 15th century. And we're looking at a page of one of those manuscripts here on the screen now to your left, the image to your left. He had read the translations of Alhazen's work, describing the advice as a device to aid in the observation of drawing and picture making. So right now, we're not really talking about the camera obscura as a camera picture making device. It's being used as a tool for drawing, basically. By the mid-16th century, lenses had begun to be used to increase the brightness and the sharpness of the image. So right now, it's just a hole in a box. There's no lens or anything happening. At first, camera obscuras were always in a room, in a house. By the 17th century, however, smaller portable versions had started to appear. Various forms evolved, including tents, sedan chairs, and pocket models. Portable camera obscuras were used widely by artists as aids for sketching. For this purpose, the most popular form was the reflex box camera obscura, in which the lens formed an upright image on a sheet of translucent paper after reflection by the inclined mirror. So we can see this in the bottom image. So on the left, we have the image of Leonardo's drawing or illustration of the camera obscura and its function. And then upper right, we see how the image from the outside relates to what is projected through the hole onto the wall opposite. Notice that it's upside down, right? And we can see in this illustration, someone who's using that as an opportunity to make a tracing of that image. So there could be some sort of surface where that image is being transferred onto, located within the box. And then a later development is something that's like quite a bit more smaller, a box that sits on a table. It has an inclined plane in on it, still functions by the image filtering with the light through the hole in the box that is then projected onto an inclined plane. And that's where you can start to see the artist making the drawing or the tracing of the image. So there are a couple of different versions that we're looking at here. One is the portable box form camera, all the way on the left, and this is the one that was used widely by artists as aids for sketching. Easy to travel with, small, right? In the second image on the right, though, we see another version, which is the tent version, a portable tent with a lens and a mirror at its apex, producing an image on a horizontal desk on the inside of a tent. So I love this image because you see the cutaway, you can see what's happening inside, how the image is projected onto this surface that is then reflected onto the drawn surface there. This would allow, as opposed to the interior of the room, right? This would allow some of the background scenery of the yard to be part of the image as well. You can make a camera obscura yourself. And that's what the students in the history of photography here at Tech are doing in the images you see on screen now. Find a light tight room. That's an important term, light tight. So no light leakage, or even a closet, or even a very large cardboard box. Pierce a small hole, no bigger than the diameter of a pencil, in one wall of the room to admit light. Inside, hold a sheet of paper a few inches away from the hole, and you will see the image of the scene outside of the room projected onto the paper, upside down and rather blurry, but recognizable. And so here we're looking at two examples of the walls of the room being used as the surface to receive the image, for the students to see the image happening. In the upper left, we're looking at an image from MedCamps. MedCamps is located here in North Louisiana. The School of Design has a strong relationship with building new structures and providing services in that way to MedCamps. And so in this image on the left, photography professor Frank Hamrick set up the room so that only a small piece of one of the windows was taped off through a washer, right? Everything else was blacked out. So a little bit of light was allowed to go through. The exposure was made over the course of 24 hours. So a little bit of a hole, a lot of time letting the light through. And what we see in the rays that are reflected on the walls here is actually the sun passing through the sky, right? The image to the right of that, the landscape that we see, is just the exterior of this Camp Alabama, which is just inside of MedCamps. So you're seeing a little bit of some of the tree edges that are reflected onto the curtains there as well. In the bottom image, though, you see the Louisiana Tech School of Design History of Photography students experiencing a camera obscura in their own classroom. So see if you can make out where the light behind the doorway to the classroom is. Okay, then look past that, and you can see reflected just above that, upside down, is actually a school that's located very close to our building called A.E. Phillips. So a lot of fun. Being in the classroom is like being inside of a camera when it's used as a camera obscura in this way. So the camera obscura already functioned like a camera, but the means for preserving or copying its images was still lacking. So photography became possible when scientists discovered that certain chemicals were sensitive to light. In about 1826, the first vague photographic image was made by Joseph Niepce. He recorded and fixed on a sheet of pewter an image he made by exposing the sensitized metal plate to natural light for almost an entire day of 8 hours. During the next decade, the painter Louis Daguerre further improved Niepce's chemical processes and produced some of the first satisfactory photographs, known ever since as daguerreotypes. He made them by exposing iodized silver plates in the presence of mercury vapor. Images were fixed onto the plate with a mineral salt solution. So there's an exposure that has to do with light and chemistry, and then there's a finishing process that has to do with fixing the image to the plate. Combining this light-sensitive chemistry with a box-sized camera obscura yielded the first camera that gave predictable results. Daguerre first published his work in 1839, and that's a convenient date to look to for the invention of photography. At first, because the necessary exposure times were so long, and if you can remember, the exposure time for the Niepce photo was 8 hours long. So because of that, photography could only record stationary objects, things that don't move. In Daguerre's photograph, Le Boulevard du Temple, taken in Paris in 1839, the streets appeared deserted because moving figures such as pedestrians and carriages made no lasting light impressions on the plate because they were moving. Only one man, having his shoes shined, stayed still long enough to become part of the image. He is visible in the corner of the lower left, and he and the partially visible shoe shiner are the first people to ever appear in a photograph. Okay, so one more thing is important to note, that daguerreotypes and other early photographic prints, such as tintypes, are one-of-a-kind images. So there's no negative here that can be used to reprint the exact same image. That development wouldn't come until much later. Despite the sophistication of modern photographic equipment, the basic mechanism of the camera is still simple and still resembles a traditional camera obscura. A camera is a light, tight box. The lens collects light from whatever is before it. The image passes through the dark chamber where it's collected upside down by the image sensor. In traditional cameras, the sensor was either a chemically treated plate or chemical film. In today's digital cameras, the sensor divides the incoming light into millions of pixels or picture elements, measuring the color and brightness of each pixel and storing the information as a series of numbers. The camera software then reconstitutes the data as a photograph for display on the camera screen. This captured image can be stored in a memory card in the camera and on the computer. We won't get too far into the technology of the camera, but you can see that there are 3 basic adjustments that can be made by the photographer, and they all have to do with the distance between the lens and the image sensor itself. That's the focal length. The aperture is the ratio between the focal length and the size of the opening, and also shutter speed, which determines the brightness of the resulting photo. How quickly or how slowly does the shutter open and close? So most of today's popular cameras, such as those that are included with smartphones, automatically set an aperture and a shutter speed, leaving the focal length for the user to adjust by zooming, basically zooming in or zooming out is your focal length. In contrast, artists and specialists generally readjust all 3 settings for each new photo. These adjustments are the kinds of choices that make artistic expression possible. For many years, the public was reluctant to accept photography as an art form because of its reliance on a mechanical device. The first common use of photography was portraiture. Before the development of the camera, only the wealthy could afford to hire artists to paint their portraits. But by the mid-19th century, most major cities had several portrait photographers. People of average means went in great numbers to photography studios to sit, stiff and unblinking, in bright sunlight for 5 to 8 seconds without moving to have their portraits made with the camera. As the 19th century progressed, shorter exposure times, less toxic technologies, and printing on paper all helped to popularize photography. From the beginning, portrait painting greatly influenced portrait photography. One of the very first portrait photographers to be regarded as an artist was Julia Margaret Cameron. By 1864, she had become an avid photographer, creating expressive portraits. Cameron pioneered the use of close-up and carefully controlled lighting to enhance the images of her subjects, who were often family members or some of her friends, and these included some of the most famous artists, writers, and thinkers of her time. Her photo, Paul and Virginia, on the right side of our screen, shows many of her artistic concerns and considerations. She finally crafted her exposure to allow enough light to perfectly define the children's round bodies and their disheveled clothing. She posed them off-center and created a dynamic balance with the umbrella and its diagonal. The two children are known to us from other photos in Cameron's body of work, but she titled this work after a popular novel about a pair of shipwrecked children. She suggests the atmosphere of the novel in both the title and the poses themselves. In late 1865, Cameron began using a larger camera, which held a 15 by 12-inch glass negative. Cameron initiated a series of large-scale close-up heads. These fulfilled her photographic vision in favor of a less precise but more emotionally penetrating form of portraiture. So if we look at the images of the two children, we can kind of see that the rendering of the detail, the clarity of the detail is an important part of the image itself. But what she's talking about here in this new technique is really trying to work with adjustments that create a more expressive, atmospheric quality to the photograph and a more emotionally penetrating form of portraiture, as she calls it. Her powerful portraits of her niece, Julia Jackson, which we see here on the left screen, depict Julia as herself, rather than a religious character or a literary character, as we know the children were meant to be. Cameron generally reserved this approach for her male sitters. So this is one of a series of portraits in which the dramatically illuminated Jackson fearlessly returns the camera's gaze. This is very much ahead of her time. Julia Jackson, the subject of this photo, would later give birth to the writer Virginia Woolf. To create even more artistic photographs, artists began to embrace the labor-intensive printing techniques that allowed them to blur unwanted details, soften the focus, add highlights and delicate veils of color, all effects that made the photograph look more like paintings in their effect. This approach to photography is known as pictorialism. Pictorialism is an international style and aesthetic movement that dominated photography during the later 19th and 20th centuries. For a pictorialist, such as the artist Gertrude Casimir, a photograph, like a painting, drawing, or engraving, was a way of projecting an emotional intent into the viewer's realm of imagination. Pictorialism refers to a style in which the photographer has somehow manipulated what would otherwise be a straightforward photograph as a means of creating an image rather than simply recording it. I think that's the distinction that we really want to understand. Creating an image rather than simply recording it. Our photo professor here talks about making a photograph versus taking a photograph, right? A classic example of pictorialism we see here on the left-hand side of the screen is Gertrude Casimir's Blessed Art Thou Among Women. The photograph pictures a mother standing with her daughter. Along with the title, the mother's gown and her protective pose suggest that motherhood is a religious calling. The image exhibits a softness of focus and a subtlety of values. Pictorial manipulation could also be boldly expressive, though, as we see in the Stieglitz photograph to the right. So Kayseber also made a portrait of the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, and so this is the image we're looking at on the right. So I just wanted to show you this is a different kind of manipulation. We can see background having these scratched out passages here, yet there's a strong graphic quality to this one. And the pose itself, the gesture of Stieglitz looking down in this way gives the photograph a kind of intensity that communicates something about the internal state of the sitter, right? It's not just a picture of a man looking down in that way. So making a photograph versus documenting a moment. Pictorialism is one of the most influential movements that sought to have photography accepted as art. That's important. The subject of the second image that we've just been talking about, Alfred Stieglitz, is a proponent of photography as art movement, a big one, and an important figure in the history of photography, not only for the work that he would make as an artist, but for Camera Work, which is a magazine that he published, which gave great deal of exposure to local photographers, artists, and poets and writers. He supported artists financially when they needed help. He was a central figure for the community of artists of the time. An early crusader in the art photography movement, right? We can think of him in that way. He opened a gallery in New York City in 1905. He was instrumental over his 50-year career in making photography an accepted art form through the magazine and through the gallery and his other efforts. In addition to his photography, Stieglitz was known for the New York art galleries that he ran in the early part of the 20th century, where he introduced many avant-garde European artists. And that would include artists that we have yet to look at. But if you know the names Picasso and Matisse, these exhibitions given by Stieglitz were some of the first instances of their work being shown in the United States. He was married to the painter Georgia O'Keeffe. And so I've included one of his later portraits of Georgia O'Keeffe here to the right of your screen. His 1901 photograph, Spring Showers, New York, is a superb exercise in tonal control. So his photography is really showing the influence of the delicate shadings and the paintings of his contemporaries in this way. The wet street looks different from the sidewalk, for example, and both differ from the misty sky that we see kind of looming in the distance, the atmospheric vehicles that we see looming in the distance. The background is out of focus, a product of intentionally choosing a shallow depth of field in the camera setting. Stieglitz created and exhibited photos to show that photographers could be as skilled as painters in capturing and interpreting the world around them. In early photographs such as this one, he revealed the poetry that he found in everyday urban scenes. French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson captured a subtle moment of drama in Place de l'Europe beyond the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris. For Cartier-Bresson, good photography is a matter of capturing the decisive moment, Here, in this example, he released the shutter at exactly the right moment and at the perfect shutter speed to capture a man leaping over a puddle on a cloudy day. The man's shape is echoed in both his own reflection and, if you look really closely, also in that of the dancer in the poster behind, just as semicircular ripples also find parallel or repetition in the round shapes close by the water. The decisive moment, clicking that shutter just at the moment where the man leaped, and all of these other elements are also strategically exactly in the best location for the photograph. Right? So it's not just capturing any moment. There's something decisive about the way all of these things come together. If Stieglitz and Cartier-Bresson wake us up to the everyday poetry that we might not otherwise notice, Manuel Alvarez Bravo photographs jarring surprises in his urban environment. His photo, Two Pairs of Legs, combines a billboard and a building site. The subjects of this work seem to ascend in pairs, starting with the legs from a shoe advertisement. Above that is a pair of lamps, and further up, a pair of double windows from an office building under construction. Other interesting revelations await anybody who is carefully, patiently viewing. The parallel between the woman's skirt and the shadow of the awning, which creates a skirt, quote unquote, on the man. The shadows of the lamps as they collide with the rectilinear pieces of the billboard, the way the bodies seem to disappear into the building above, and how the photographer's angle of vision makes room for the sign at the top. Other photographers went beyond the camera itself to achieve more inventive effects. Man Ray, for example, made innovative photographs, which he called rayographs, by placing objects on the light-sensitive paper itself and exposing them to sunlight. The rayographs are photographs in which no cameras or lenses are used. They are also visual inventions recorded on film. Sometimes, as in the work pictured here, it's not really even clear what the original subject is. Each generation produces its own memorable photographs. And such photographs move us not only because of the way their subjects are presented, but also because we know the photographer was present at the scene, allowing us to join them as witness. The significance of such images lies not only in their ability to inform us, but also in their power to stir our emotions. For this reason, it's sometimes difficult to really distinguish between the photograph as art and the photograph as document. Both rely on the elements of art. Both intend to communicate to the viewer. The difference, I think, is in the intention of the artist. Only a few decades after the invention of photography, photographers began to bring public attention to suffering caused by war, poverty, hunger, and neglect. The new tool made visual statements believable in ways that no essay or drawing could. Of all the arts, photography is uniquely suited not only to documenting events or social problems, but also to bringing about empathetic awareness that can lead to reform. An early leader in the use of photography for social change was the Danish-born American Jacob Riis. In the late 19th century, he photographed squalid living and working conditions in poor areas of New York and published them for the world to see. Photographs such as 5 Cents a Spot drew public attention that led to stricter housing codes and improved work safety laws. The vividness of this photo was made possible by the recent invention of flash photography, which allowed Riis to take his camera into dark corners. His most famous book, How the Other Half Lives, was a landmark in the social impact of photography. Photojournalism falls squarely into the realm of photography as documentation, photojournalism. Dorothea Lange was a photographer who traveled 17,000 miles in her car one summer, working as a photographer for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Farm Security Administration on a program that was intended to document the conditions of hardship caused by the Great Depression. Migrant Mother is perhaps Dorothea Lange's most well-known photograph of a mother and all of her children, her 3 children, all of whom have been displaced from their homes by the Depression and by drought. I do not remember how I explained my presence or the camera to her, says Lange of the image. I do remember that she asked me no questions. For most of the 20th century, photography enjoyed an unquestioned reputation as a vehicle of truth, giving rise to the saying, "The camera never lies." Margaret Burke White was an American photographer and a documentary photographer. She was arguably the best known as the first American female war photojournalist, and in 1930, she became the first Western photographer allowed to enter the Soviet Union and make photographs. Photojournalism is the communication of news through photographs. These images tend to appear in print newspapers and magazines, as well as online media sites and microblogging platforms. A picture is worth 8,000 words and can instantly enhance the story that a news article communicates to its readers. During the 1930s, Margaret Burke White introduced the concept of the photographic essay, an approach that other photographers very soon developed or adopted themselves. A photo essay is a collection of photographs on a single subject, arranged to tell a story or convey a mood in a way that is not possible with a single photograph. Burke White documented construction projects, industrial plants, foreign customs, and Depression-era poverty in many such photo essays. On assignment to document the effects of a flood in 1937, she created African-American flood victims lined up, one of the more famous images of the Depression in the United States. Environmental photography deals with documenting and introducing our surroundings. This niche photography category focuses on the relationship between nature and humans. It's often a tool for raising awareness of important environmental and conservation issues like climate change. But the focus can also be on social issues, addressing community problems as well. Environmental photographers can be photojournalists, they can be biologists, they can be wildlife photographers, conservationists, and people with different professions but concerned about their environment. Ansel Adams often used his photographs to increase public awareness of the need for conservation of the natural environment. His Clearing Winter Storm, Yosemite National Park, California, reflects the symphonic grandeur of nature's design. It renders the cathedral-like Yosemite Valley as an orchestration in black and white, where stark rock mingles with soft mist. All is in perfect focus in an infinite depth of field, which Adams achieved by using a high f-stop. He also carefully adjusted the lighting during the development process by selectively exposing some parts of the picture to more light. Adams viewed aspects of nature as symbols of spiritual life, capable of transcending the conflicts of society. In his majestic black and white photographs, nature becomes a timeless metaphor for spiritual harmony. Today's environmental photographers are more likely to focus on the serious human impact on our surroundings. For example, Chris Steele Perkins traveled to the Marshall Islands in the Pacific in 2004, and he found that rising sea levels threaten the very existence of these islands. His photo from the series Marshall Islands shows a makeshift seawall created out of cast-offs and junk, a desperate attempt to hold back the rising tides. Steele Perkins is one of 10 photographers who collaborated on the book and exhibition, North, South, East, West, a 360-degree view of climate change, a worldwide compendium of the problem. Over 7 years, New Orleans-based photographer Tina Freeman has photographed the Louisiana wetlands and the glacial landscape of the Arctic and Antarctic. The project, Lamentations, is a series of diptychs that functions as stories about climate change, ecological balance, and the connectedness of things across time and space. And just as a reminder, a diptych is 2 images that are meant to function as one. So it's the 2 together that ask us to make a comparison between them in order to come up with our interpretation. Okay. The 2 locations in these images tell the story of her concern without much interpretation. Louisiana's 3 million acres of wetlands are disappearing at the rate of about 75 square kilometers annually. Sea level rise is one of many factors. The melting of the glaciers contributes to sea level rise, and there we see the connection she's making. Freeman says, I want the images to seduce the viewer. First, I want them to see the staggering beauty of what surrounds us, to fall in love with our Earth, to view her fragility and seeming timelessness. Second, I want them to think about why the images are in pairs, and finally to realize that the frozen water in one frame may soon end up inundating the wetlands in our own backyard. Photography began as primarily black and white process. Indeed, for the first 100 years, black and white was the only practical option for photographers. Through much of the 20th century, technical problems with color persisted. Film and printing papers were expensive. Color prints faded over time. Even when fairly accurate color became practical, many photographers felt that color lacked the abstract power of the black and white image. The development of color photography began in 1907 with the invention of color transparencies. In 1932, the Eastman Kodak Company began making color film. The key invention came in 1936 with Kodachrome film, which substantially improved the versatility and accuracy of color photography. Later progress improved the relative permanence of color prints. Through the 1960s, most art photographers disdained color film, so it took a while before people began to accept it. At first, they did so because the chemical development processes yielded unstable prints that faded or evolved toward red over time. Later, because color photographs were associated with family snapshots and tourist photographs. Elliott Porter took an interest in color photography in the late 1930s as Kodachrome film became more commonly available. Inspired in part by Ansel Adams' majestic views, Porter hoped to capture nature's quieter moments with more vividness through color. We see this in Water Seeps, Glen Canyon, Utah, September 1962. The picture captures a section of a rock cliff stained into an abstract pattern by the action of the water over a period of years. In addition to his career as an artist, Porter frequently lent his services to environmental causes as well. William Eggleston was born in 1939 in Memphis, Tennessee, and grew up in the Mississippi Delta. He's lived in Memphis for the majority of his life. In 1976, the Museum of Modern Art opened an exhibition of William Eggleston's color photographs, and this was a show that would be remembered as a turning point in the history of photography. The press release announcing the exhibition described a new generation of photographers whose work mobilized color in new and inventive ways. Unlike most of their predecessors, this is a quote whose color has been either formless or too pretty. A new generation of young photographers has begun to use color in a confident spirit of freedom and naturalness. In their work, the role of color is more than simply descriptive or decorative and assumes a central place in the definition of the picture's content. Eggleston's photographs from the Los Alamos portfolio are elegant compositions of everyday things. We're looking at Untitled or Knee-High Bottle on a car hood. In this image, two cars block out an abstract composition of off-balance diagonals against a paved background that is darkened by wedges of shadow. The bottle seems perfectly positioned to both anchor the composition. So if you take a minute and just cover the bottle with your hand and see what the photograph looks like without it, right? So it anchors the composition and it also beautifully captures the sunlight, so performing multiple functions. Besides the skillful arrangement, the photo captures our attention because it immediately evokes a world, a casual social setting in some rural area of America on a warm afternoon. He says, I had this notion of what I called a democratic way of looking around, that nothing was more or less important. He wanted the viewer to look at the photographs the way one looks at the world. This radical attitude guided his groundbreaking work in color photography, work that has prefigured many recent developments in art and photography. So we're going to look at a contemporary photographer, Sig Harvey. These are two images from her series called Gardening at Night. In this body of work, she cites magical realism as a source of inspiration. She says of her work, I'm very interested in finding magic in the real world, and photography reminds me that this world is amazing. Near the end of the 20th century, the chemical photograph negative began to go out of fashion, and especially under the impact of new digital technologies. Though photochemical film is still manufactured and sold, artists using digital cameras and photo editing computer programs can manipulate image files with ease. The implications of these changes are profound. If a photo can be altered in almost any imaginable way, then its reputation as a vehicle of truth has expired, and the camera can indeed lie. Many contemporary photographers are taking advantage of these facts. Jeff Wall, for example, calls himself a near documentary photographer. He creates these scenes that seem vividly real, yet they also retain a decidedly stagey quality. So in Boy Falls from Tree seems to be a matter-of-fact photo of an unfortunate but not entirely uncommon event. Yet Wall created it at his computer by combining several photos. Photographing the falling boy in motion would require a fast shutter speed that would greatly limit the depth of field, but today's digital cameras enable such effects. I would also argue that you'd have to convince somebody to jump out of a tree to make this photograph, all in one setting. Wall takes full advantage of the high resolution technology by blowing up his pictures to maximum size. In this case, this photograph is about 8 by 10 feet. We're left wondering when we look at it, what is real and what is manipulated in this too perfect picture of a minor calamity. Gregory Crutzen is an American photographer who makes large-scale, cinematic, psychologically charged prints of staged scenes set in suburban landscapes and interiors. He directs a large production and lighting crew to construct his images. Often working with a large team, Crutzen typically plans each image with a meticulous attention to detail. He orchestrates the light, the color, and the production design to conjure dreamlike scenes that are infused with both mystery and suspense. While the small town settings of many of Crutzen's images are broadly familiar, he's careful to avoid anything that is identifiable in terms of sites or monuments or signage that means that these images establish a world outside of time. His carefully staged photographs concentrate on a tension between domesticity, nature, and the unknown. The characters in his elaborate constructions act subconsciously, as if they're under the spell of a foreign entity almost. Their unusual actions suggest a mysterious narrative involving supernatural contact. And Crutzen has acknowledged Steven Spielberg's film Close Encounters of the Third Kind as a primary influence. In that movie, an average American man is emotionally and psychologically changed after contact with a UFO. Like the character in the film, Crutzen's subjects perform eccentric and ritual-like acts. So thinking about the last two images that we saw, they're both share in common that they fall into a category of photograph called stage photography. Staged. In other words, everything is prearranged by the maker of the photograph. Jeff Wall, who's the first one of the boy falling out of the tree, hides his manipulation of the photos he takes in order to make them appear natural, right? So there's a kind of a hiding the fact that it's a lie kind of motivation behind those photographs. In the case of Gregory Crutzen, we don't see the incredible team of workers, actors, and equipment that are used to make those staged photographs. But other photographers explicitly maximize the editing potential of software to create vivid and complex images. And one of these is James Welling, who began his career using film, but he eagerly embraced the new technology as it developed. Welling's photograph 9812 is one of a series in which he layered together other photos of modern dance companies, landscapes, and government buildings. This photo includes the Los Angeles Contemporary Dance Company, the Nova installation by SoftLab in Madison Square Park in New York City, and the Orange County Government Center in Goshen, New York. Welling saturated each of the three source photos in red, green, and blue, the basic colors of digital photography. Then he mixed them together as adjustment layers in Photoshop. The result is a highly dynamic collage of a figure in a dense backdrop with rich splashes of digital color. To me, this lines up with abstract painting in really interesting ways. Welling uses software to create almost as a painter might, arranging forms in a constructed space with applied color. He prints his photos in high resolution and large format to increase the impact. So we're talking now not so much about a photograph that I'm holding in my hand, right? And there's a very different thing to experience an image like this, larger than the size of your own body, right? When he exhibits the works from this series, he also makes available a booklet for viewers that sets forth all the steps he took to reach the final images. So it's interesting the way that he wants the viewers to know about his process. Artists have recently explored a variety of techniques, both photochemical and digital, to go beyond photography's assumed limits. Laura Tiebergen, for example, creates non-representational photographs using only light. For a series called Filters, she directed light through colored glasses onto sheets of sensitive paper that she developed chemically. The bright colors are a conscious choice to create an otherworldly appearance. She regards chemical and digital photography as entirely different media. So one is of substance, the chemistry and the substance of it. And the other one is virtual and pixel, right? So to her, the difference between those two processes is really important. She says of the Filter series, these images are not photographs. They are created in my lab with no representation of reality. I feel like I am inside my camera. Kyle Meyer uses photography in a new kind of portraiture that both reveals and conceals the subject. On several trips to Southern Africa, he photographed gay men, posing them wearing brightly colored cloth turbans on their heads. Back in his studio, he printed the digital prints at nearly life size and then shredded them into thin strips along with the turban. He then wove the photo and the cloth pieces together so that the person is also physically present in their portrait. Meyer thus brings visibility to people who may be marginalized, but not enough visibility to endanger them. Here's something from the artist statement. Over the past several years, my artistic foundation in photography has been plagued with a single question. How can a digital image serve any human connection when it is entirely produced by mechanical means, whether camera, computer, or printer? This has led to extensive research and apprenticeship with handicraft artisans, exploring the tactile potential of photography. Through each successive body of work I create, traces of the handmade are present, be it weaving, hand dyeing, or layering, all of which adds form of texture, dimension, and ultimately additional meaning to my work. Abelardo Morel was 12 years old when he and his family fled Cuba for the US because his father's life had been threatened by Castro. Morel is well known in the photographic community for creating camera obscura images in various places around the world and photographing these. One of the satisfactions I get from making this imagery, he says, comes from my seeing the weird and yet natural marriage of the inside and the outside. And so we're looking at one of these camera obscura images to the left-hand side of your screen, where you can see light emanating through the cracks of the doorway in the room. The wall of the room is the projected surface for the image, and the image itself is a view of Lower Manhattan at sunrise. It's quite beautiful. And the experience of letting your eye adjust back and forth between the facts of the interior and the illusion of the exterior is pretty interesting. And I think that that's one of the things that the artist himself is interested in. So we are looking at a contemporary use of the camera obscura. The image ultimately would be a print, a fairly large scale print as well. Morel is also known for his tent camera. This is a device that he invented to allow him to merge landscape photographs with the texture and the composition of the ground where he places his camera and tripods. So at the top of your screen on the right, you're looking just at an illustration of the device that he's created and how it works relative to the imagery. You see the way the tree filters through the lens and then is projected onto the ground, right? Okay, so we'll keep that in mind, then look at the photographic example that is just below that. So he's making a photograph of, yes, what the camera obscura is projecting, but notice how the photograph has all these textural elements in it. You look close, you can start to see elements of the ground, you can see leaves and cracks and things that are becoming the surface texture of the photograph itself. So here again, we have these two qualities that are overlaying themselves. They're overlaying each other, right? The majestic, which is the scene of the mountains, and the mundane, which is the ground where the artist is standing. Both of those things combine in this photograph. He says, I couldn't imagine how I would approach making landscape images myself. But like many immigrants, I felt moved to explore the vastness of my adopted country. To picture America's national parks, I invented a device, part tent and part periscope, to show how the immediacy of the ground we walk on enhances our understanding of the panorama, the larger world it helps to form. I wanted to find a way to make these well-known views of familiar and iconic places into my own private discoveries. So the resulting photographs are a mix of image and texture. The image is that of a common scenic view, but the texture is derived from the land itself. The 4th century poet Liu Qi wrote, "We enclose boundless space in a square foot of paper." I know he was defining the task of the poet, says Morel, but to me, his words shape my own ambition as a photographer. Richard Mizrach is one of the most influential photographers of his generation. In the 1970s, he helped pioneer the renaissance of color photography and large-scale presentations that are in widespread practice today. Best known for his ongoing series, Desert Cantos, a multifaceted approach to the study of place and man's complex relationship to it, he has worked in the landscape for over 40 years. He also has a series of photographs that serve as a documentation of the industrial corridor along the Mississippi River, known as Cancer Alley, and also On the Beach, which is an aerial perspective of human interaction and isolation. On the Beach, which really deals with human interaction and isolation, I think relates to the image that we're looking at now in subject matter. So this work shares in common with its previous subjects of humans and the environment and isolation as a subject. It has in common that it embodies the artist's longstanding interest in landscape and seascape imagery. But this is what he calls a reverse color process. In other words, the negative becomes part of the look of the final image of the print. So this is a reverse color process that transforms the natural landscape in extreme and fascinating ways. The images are both foreign and familiar. So we recognize a figure on a rock projecting out into the sea. There's a gesture of a dance of some kind. There are clouds in the background. So just inherent in the single figure in the midst of this vast environment is a lot of content or meaning there having to do with the isolation of an individual, perhaps, or how big the world is and how small we are, perhaps. So that part may be familiar, but when we look at the image, and especially the image in relationship to the others in the series, the color and the reversal really suggests something somewhat apocalyptic, almost like an apocalyptic vision of the natural world as we have known it. The question to ask is how much of what we see in a photograph is real? Is truthfulness important in photography? And is it really possible? So something to think about as you move forward into the world and look at more photographs, hopefully. Contemporary art photography moves away from documentation, truth, journalism, and awareness raising to much more to invention, experimentation, and expression. Photography may not have the long history in art that design and painting, sculpture, and architecture might, but it is engaging with some very interesting and very important contemporary questions, and it plays a role in so many aspects of our lives.